In the last 2 years, I've coached over 170 fantasy writers in my various programs, passing on everything I've learned from publishing my own 4 fantasy novels. This has helped a lot of writers finish their first drafts, achieve major breakthroughs with their stories, and some of them, like Peter Christensen and Michael Johnson, are even planning to publish their debut novels in the next few months, which is really exciting. I recently surveyed these 170 writers to ask, what is the most useful writing lesson you gained from working with me? And today, I'll be sharing their top 10 most impactful lessons, some of which actually surprised me. So from the hundreds of hours I've spent on coaching calls and from the hundreds of hours I've spent editing novels and giving story feedback, you're about to get some of the best storytelling insights I've passed on to my clients.
Jed knows his stuff.
This is probably the best investment I've made in my writing.
It was so immensely helpful.
I will think of going through this program as the best decision I made for my writing career.
And to explain the first big lesson, let me share a very common issue that many writers have when they initially start working with me. And that issue is feeling overwhelmed by their story. As Samantha said before she joined my fantasy outlining bootcamp,
I had just ideas all over the place and notebooks and pages full of things that had no order.
So you're probably wondering right now, what is the solution to this? Well, inside my bootcamp, which just for a bit of context is a 7-week group coaching program where I help writers develop their story, I have this exercise where I get my students to create a 1-page guiding principles document. This essentially aims to capture the essence of your book, what I call your story core, down onto just 1 page.
We worked a lot on finding the story's core and then sort of branching outward off of that, so everything just feels very cohesive. Jed is so great at just focusing everything down and really helping you to figure out what is important, why are you telling this story.
So that's exactly what your 1-page guiding principles document does. It just cuts through all the noise and it gives you this North Star to follow so that you never feel lost when you're writing or editing your story. So how do you actually build this document? Well, this right here is the exact guiding principles document that I made in 2017 when I was outlining my space fantasy novel, Across the Broken Stars, which, by the way, is getting close to crossing over 100 reviews on Amazon, which is really exciting. As you can see, this guiding document is essentially an at-a-glance reference sheet that basically helps keep you focused and inspired as you write this story by reminding you, hey, this is what the story is fundamentally about. So to do this, I suggest that you include your premise, a 1-sentence description of your story, your theme, a moral statement about how best to live, which will be explored in different ways by different characters and other elements of your story. And as I often say in my videos, theme is not about preaching, it's not about shoving an idea down readers' throats. Rather, it is about posing an interesting moral question as a way to generate a certain philosophical conflict that deepens your story. The next thing you might want to include is your main character's arc. You can watch my video titled How to Write Fantasy Character Arcs Better Than 99% of Writers if you want to go deeper with this. But at a very high level, a character arc is defined by these 5 key questions. First of all, you have your ghost, a traumatic past event that shaped your character's worldview, forming the lie, a misconception about how the world is, which leads to your character pursuing their want, an external thing that they think will bring them happiness, but in reality, they actually should be trying to find their need. This is the thing that will actually bring them happiness, but the only way to achieve it is by accepting their truth, a personalized antidote to the lie, which allows them to gain a more accurate or useful understanding of reality. And then the last main thing I like to include in my 1-page guiding principles document is a short synopsis. So you can see here in this example guiding principles document for Across the Broken Stars, I have redacted the ending because I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't already read it. Now, those are the kind of fundamental essentials I suggest you include in your 1-page guiding principles document, but you can also add things like your designing principle. So this is a structural or conceptual idea that organizes and drives the narrative of your story, shaping how your plot unfolds and how you're going to be exploring your theme. So for example, the designing principle of The Name of the Wind is that we're going to frame the story as a confession or as a recount told over 3 days, allowing Quoth's self-mythologizing to be challenged by the tension between the sort of poetic past that he describes and the mundane present where he is just, this kind of run-of-the-mill innkeeper. The next thing you may want to optionally consider is the moral problem of the story, which is basically just posing your theme in question form to allow your characters to come up with all these different answers. You may also want to include some sub-themes and really anything else that's going to help you when you go through and writing the story. Now, I'd always personally known how useful a 1-page guiding principle document was. And like I said, I've been doing this in my writing since at least 2017, maybe even a little bit earlier. But the next big lesson that my 176 students taught me was something I never saw coming. And to explain this, I need to share a bit of a misconception I had about writing for a long time. You see, for most of my life, I've always thought that writing was a solo sport. You sit at your desk, you wrestle with your outline, you write draft after draft in isolation, and sure, maybe you talk about your ideas with your friends, and maybe a few of them agree to do some beta reading if you're lucky, but for the most part, I think a lot of us toil away on our writing by ourselves. Now, of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and honestly, that describes most of my early years as a writer. There is tremendous joy to be found in wrestling with your ideas by yourself. But as I started to work with more writers in my different programs, especially group programs like my bootcamp, I began to see how powerful it is when writers stop doing this alone and they learn how to embrace the value of community instead.
Your peers are absolutely essential to improving your work. Having a community to bounce your ideas off of and receive honest feedback from is probably the most valuable resource this bootcamp has to offer.
Now, after running 4 boot camps with about 35 writers in total, I was just getting the same feedback over and over again about how amazing it was to have this dedicated community to support you as a fantasy writer. So about 6 months ago, I actually created a dedicated ongoing community called the Fantasy Writers Guild, designed to give writers weekly accountability, peer feedback, and my direct support so that you can not only write a better book, but also just have way more fun along the way. We currently have about 80 members in the guild, and it has honestly been just such a joy to see the progress all the writers have made inside. Here's what Arwen said, who went through cohort 2 of my bootcamp and was also one of the founding members of our guild.
Having the guild there to provide a little bit of structure each week that's like, write down what you got done, write down what the best part of your week was, what was something that you learned about your process or about the story that you're telling, is a really great way to sit down and like organize my thoughts at the end of each week, and to also just sort of look back on the progress that I have made, which just feels really great. It's also really, really cool talking to people from all over the world about writing, this thing that we're all doing, that we all love doing.
Just to give some quick props to Arwen, I've been so impressed with his progress because when he applied for my bootcamp in January of 2024, he said that he had really struggled to finish his writing projects. But after going through the bootcamp and then being a guild member for a few months, he actually finished his first draft in November of 2024. And just last week, he finished editing his second draft as well. So if you can find some way to build a bit of community around your writing, it's going to help you go so much further as an author. And if you want to join the amazing community of writers that we have inside the guild, you can apply by using the link in the description below this video or by going to jedherne.com/guild. This is the main way I'm actually working with writers at the moment, and I find so much fulfillment from seeing the progress our members make every single week. Now, this brings me to the third big lesson that my 170 plus clients have learned from working with me. And this third lesson contains probably the most useful character development exercise I've learned, although it's really hard to pick just one because in all my different programs, there's a lot of different exercises I give my students, and I like to tailor them based on what I think each writer needs. But when I learned this technique, my characters stopped feeling flat and unrealistic, and instead, they became far more richly detailed, complex, and psychologically intriguing, which made them so much more interesting for me to write. And it's also produced the same results for my students as well.
The character exploration was incredible. It was a lot deeper than I was used to, despite having read, books and taken other courses online.
Here's the idea. When people talk about three-dimensional characters, they rarely define what a dimension actually is. But it's really quite simple. A dimension is a consistent contradiction between two aspects of a character's nature, and this contradiction creates a level of internal conflict and tension. For example, you might have an unremarkable, down-on-his-luck innkeeper who's given up on life, but in his youth he was a talented magical prodigy and a very charismatic musician. This right there creates a contradiction, mundane versus exceptional. We want to know, how did this magical prodigy become so jaded and broken? And how can these two identities exist within the same soul? That contradictory nature, it fascinates us as readers. And it is the essential basis of Quoth's character from The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, I like to think about each character as having a core contradiction, and often that core contradiction is going to form the axis of their internal journey. For example, if we look at Logan Ninefingers from Joe Abercrombie's First Law series, one of my favorite characters of all time, I would say his core contradiction is peace seeker versus bloody killer. Logan is this battle-hardened warrior who wants to leave his violent past behind and become a better man. But when the blood starts flying, especially when he sort of transforms into his Bloody Nine persona, he turns into this nearly unstoppable berserker with no remorse and no restraint. And this inner war between the man he desperately wants to be and the monster he fears he truly is deep down, That right there forms the emotional engine of his character arc. The next big contradiction Logan has is savage versus philosopher. So Logan, like I said before, he's this brutal Northman. He's spent most of his life in tribal warfare, yet he often reflects on sort of death and fate and morality with a surprising level of insight. Joe Abercrombie even described him as the thinking man's barbarian, which I think is the absolute perfect way of putting it, because he's questioning violence, even as he's dishing it out. The third big contradiction Logan has is loyal versus unstable. He's fiercely loyal to the people he travels with. He bonds very deeply with Pharaoh, Jezal, and the rest of the group, but his violent nature, especially when the Bloody Nine comes and sort of takes over, makes him fundamentally unstable. The fourth big contradiction is brave versus fearful. Logan is undeniably brave, right? He's fighting impossible battles and he survives encounter and encounter against all odds. But internally, he's ruled by a lot of fear. He's afraid of what he's capable of. He's afraid of losing control. He's afraid of becoming the Bloody Nine again. And this contrast between external courage and internal dread, it makes him feel deeply human. The fifth big contradiction he has is barbarian versus civilized outsider. So he's clearly from this more tribal, uncivilized, backwater culture up in the north, but in many scenes, we actually see Logan showing far more honor and decency than the supposedly refined Unioners down in the south. The sixth big contradiction he has is fatalist versus hopeful. So Logan frequently tells us people don't change. He's resigned to the violence that defines his life. But deep down, he really hopes he's wrong about that. He keeps hoping, however faintly, that maybe he can be a better man. But can he really change? That's fundamentally the question that drives the whole series. And of course, you can find a lot more than just those 6 contradictions with Logan if you keep digging. I actually talked with Joe about this idea of building contradictions when we were doing an analysis of Savine's introduction in A Little Hatred. What I think is really interesting is that I don't think Joe realized he was consciously using this technique, but you'll see what he said when I brought it up. And we see a lot of those contradictions get built in the opening here as well. How much do you directly think about contradictions when it comes to characters?
I don't know. It's not something I would necessarily, that would be at the forefront of my mind, or at least I wouldn't think to myself, let's have someone who can be who seems warm and loving, but can be very cold and calculating internally. Or actually, I might think that, because funnily enough, I'm working on a character right now who comes across as someone who is cold, hard, driven by a much greater purpose to which everything must be sacrificed. And she has a horrible failure in her past. And you assume the awful thing is she went too far and did something so incredibly ruthless that it became unforgivable. But actually, the problem is that she was merciful at the wrong time. And so I suppose it is on my mind sometimes, how are you going to get a surprise out of this character? What's the big twist going to be?
Now, on a practical level, when it comes to developing the contradictions in your own characters, you may want to be considering contradictions between the outward-facing aspects of your character. So maybe this pretty charming socialite is actually a savage assassin who kills for fun. The second thing you may want to look at is contradiction between 2 competing desires. So maybe your character desperately wants to ascend to the throne, but then they also have this urge within themselves to just go off and live a relaxing, quiet life in the countryside. The third big thing to think about with contradictions is try to find a contradiction between a conscious and subconscious desire. So maybe your character wants to find this powerful magical relic, but deep down, all they really want is their father's approval. And this brings me to the 4th big lesson from the 170 plus fantasy writers I've worked with, which is that it's all about finding your own process. My advice for learning the craft of storytelling can basically be summarized in one Bruce Lee quote. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. With all the programs I run, whether it's my boot camp or my one-on-one editing or my live workshops or the community inside the guild, I try to never make it about forcing you to use one strict method to write your stories. Yes, there are fundamental principles that it is important to grasp. In a sense, you do have to learn some of the rules before you break them. But really, my goal as a teacher is simply to give you the tools and processes that have worked well for me and have worked well for my students before, and then to show you how to adapt them to best suit you. Like I said before, I've published 4 books, but I've probably written around 7 or 8 in total, and my process is subtly different from story to story. To quote from Paul, who went through my bootcamp,
Jed's guidance through the program shows you what works best for him, but he doesn't really shoebox you into his program. He basically lets you discover what works for you. Jed shows you the process that will help you develop your own voice and your own process to outline.
Now, as we move on to the fifth big lesson that writers have learned from going through my programs, this fifth lesson is a really tactical, specific one to do with hooking readers in your first chapter. For a bit of context here, to get in my programs, you have to submit an application, and that usually includes a few pages of your writing, something around 5 to 10 pages in total. And given that I've worked with 170 plus writers in the past 2 years, this means I've looked through hundreds and hundreds of different story samples from these applicants because I tend to be fairly selective with who I actually let work with me. And after reviewing all these writing samples, I've noticed a very common pattern. Most first chapters fail to hook the reader. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that, as I've shown my students, it only takes a few small tweaks to craft an opening chapter that makes readers immediately addicted to your story. I went into this in a lot of detail inside my first chapter critique workshop. This was a live training program where I basically took 47 fantasy writers, I got them all to send in their first chapters to me, and then I picked 3 of them to edit in real time on the workshop.
It was really nice being in a group setting and just interacting and seeing live examples laid out before me where I was able to kind of reflect on my own work and my own flaws and my own strengths as well.
By the way, the full recording of that workshop, along with an even more in-depth course on first chapters, is available for free inside the Fantasy Writers Guild. So, let me show you the 3 main tweaks that generally created the most improvement for my students' first chapters. The first one is to give us a clear goal. The quickest way to improve your opening chapter is to ensure that we have a clear goal on page 1. Let me give you 2 examples. One bad example that doesn't do this, and one good example that does do this, so that you can actually see what I mean here in action. The bad example here. Let's imagine you're reading a story that opens with a character just walking through a market. She's describing all the pungent spices and the loud chatter of squabbling merchants, maybe the clucking of chickens, but no matter how evocative and poetic that description might feel, the chapter is probably going to fall flat. But as soon as you add a goal, let's say the character is going through the market and trying to find her target to assassinate him, all of a sudden the story takes on a much sharper edge because now we've sort of ratcheted up this element of suspense. You've created a question within your reader's mind, and that gives your reader permission to open up and allow themselves to just fall into your story in a more immersive way. Now, something you might be wondering about here is, well, Jed, do I have to start with my story's main goal on page 1? No, absolutely not. It can be a much smaller goal just to get us through the first few chapters. For example, the initial goal that Harry has at the start of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is, I just want to get through Dudley's birthday party without being punished. But it gives those scenes early on in the book enough momentum and tension to get us into the narrative. Once you've got a strong goal in your first chapter, the second principle you want to be thinking about is to try to use your first chapter to show your story in miniature. So have a think about what emotions your story is going to explore, what tone, world-building elements, or character dynamics are going to be central to your book, and then see if you can find a way to give us a little taste test of that in chapter 1. For example, in my pirate fantasy novel, The Thunder Heist, the overall story is about Kef Cutmark trying to steal a device that channels electricity from lightning from the city made from 1,000 ships floating on a monster-infested sea. So how do I set this up in the first chapter? Well, I basically treat that first chapter as a little mini heist where Kef is imprisoned and about to be executed, only for her to reveal that she intentionally let herself get captured to free a fellow prisoner. So you can see right there how this is very clearly the whole story compressed down into this miniature, almost short story format within the first few pages. And then the third big thing to be thinking about with your first chapter is to add a characteristic moment. A characteristic moment is a unique decision that reveals who your protagonist really is. I like to sometimes call this the 99% rule, which is this idea that you want to show your character making a decision that 99% of other characters just would not do in the same situation. Once you can do that, it unlocks the holy grail of character uniqueness, because especially if you can do this early after introducing your characters, you will now have established this note of unpredictability and distinctiveness that makes readers lean in and really want to know more about who this person is. For example, in the opening of Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry, Viv, a battle-hardened orc mercenary, walks away from her adventuring career, lays down her sword, and decides to open a coffee shop in a city that doesn't even know what coffee is. It's a brilliant characteristic moment because it's just not something that we see orcs typically do in a fantasy story. And so when I was reading it, I was immediately thinking, whoa, okay, there's something different going on here. Now, there's actually another principle you can be using to improve your reader's sense of engagement with your first chapters, which brings me on to the 6th main lesson that a lot of my clients have learned from me. But the cool thing about this next principle is it's not just something that is applicable to your first chapter, but rather to every single chapter and every single scene you write in your story. Here is the lesson. Pay attention to your rate of revelation. This is something that Levi, who did my first chapter critique workshop, found very eye-opening. And the rate of revelation refers to how quickly you are delivering new, meaningful information to your reader. When I say meaningful, I just mean anything that advances the plot, reveals character, deepens your world, raises the tension, or sharpens the theme of your story. Let me give you an example of a bad paragraph with a slow rate of revelation, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Luca narrowed his eyes as he watched the mansion from atop a nearby roof. Golden light spilled out through the mansion's windows, staining the street below. The mansion itself was an imposing structure, with its silhouette cutting a stark figure against the blackness of the night sky. The air was cool and still. There was a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Gargoyles perched atop the gabled roof of the mansion, looking menacing in the darkness. Luca ran his gaze across the windows, studying them intently. So that paragraph probably felt a bit boring to you, right? Because we have 7 sentences, but they're not adding a lot of new information. Like, he's looking at this mansion, it's dark, we get it. So let's try to improve that example by increasing the rate of revelation. Luca narrowed his eyes as he watched the mansion from atop a nearby roof. Golden light spilled from an open window on the 3rd floor. One of the partying guests must have left it open. Perfect. That was his way in. He checked his belt, making sure his dagger and poison flask was in reach. Then he flicked a grapple across the street. The padded hook latched onto a gargoyle on the mansion's roof. Luca slithered over, then descended towards the open window, feeling grim determination fill his body. He had waited too long for this. Do you see here how every sentence is building new understanding and deeper curiosity? The thing is, when someone says a scene is badly paced, what they usually mean is just that they're not getting enough new information hitting them quickly enough. And this means they can mentally switch off because they're not having to pay any attention. Of course, you're probably realizing here that you can go the opposite way and sometimes be too fast. You don't always need a fast rate of revelation throughout your entire fantasy novel. And part of the skill of writing is knowing when to slow things down and linger. But especially in your first chapter, I usually find that most new fantasy authors are too slow in how they drip out information. Instead, you want to reward readers, especially early on, by giving them this sense of fast progress and rapid development. So this brings me to the 7th big lesson that my students have learned from working with me. And specifically, this is a lesson that has really come up a lot inside my fantasy outlining bootcamp. And this lesson is that outlining fuels creativity. It does not kill it.
It actually had the opposite of what I expected, in that I thought an outline would kill the creativity. But in fact, with that bird's eye view, it gave me more to work with, more to add in.
So how do you outline in a way that makes you more excited to write instead of reducing your excitement to write? Well, inside the bootcamp, I take writers through a process I call the hourglass outlining method, which breaks down outlining into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is to explore the suburb. This is where you explore all the possibilities of your story. You play with world-building ideas, character possibilities, and plot fragments, and you're basically asking yourself, what could this story become? In my opinion, the biggest mistake most writers make with outlining is jumping into structure too early. I find that when you do this, it can really kill your creative momentum because it starts to make things feel too regimented too quickly. But if you instead begin with a loose exploration through different notes, brainstorming, free writing, different exercises, it gives you the freedom to sort of wander, just like a discovery writer does in the first draft. The difference though between being an outliner and a discovery writer though is that if you outline this initial exploration phase, it might only take you a few days or a few weeks. And that's because you're doing it in this sort of higher level, kind of broader overview way. But if you dive right into your first draft straight away, and you're using that first draft as the only means you have to discover your story, it is very common to spend years just to get that first draft down, only to step back and realize that you've only got 10% of that draft actually being usable because the rest just lacks cohesion. That's the mistake I made early on in my writing with my very first book. And, this is my kind of pet peeve with the discovery writer versus outliner, paradigm or spectrum that people talk about, because in both cases, you are discovering your story. It is just a lot easier, in my opinion, to do your discovery through dot points rather than writing 100,000 word manuscripts and realizing, oh, hang on, I went the wrong direction there. So once you've gone through this exploring the suburb phase, it is time to then move on to phase 2, finding your story's core. So this next step is all about zooming in and trying to find the essence of your story. This is where your 1-page guiding principles document comes in, which we talked about earlier in this video. And in this phase, you're really answering questions like, what's my 1-sentence premise? What themes am I exploring? What's my main character's arc? What's at the center of this story? The reason you want to ask those kind of questions is that once you develop that level of clarity, it becomes this fantastic filter. You can now ask, okay, I've got this scene here, I've got this character here, I've got this subplot. Does that serve the core of my story, or is it distracting from it instead? So now that you've found your story's core, it's now time to sort of expand back outwards from that core. So this is where you start mapping out your structure. I like to use 9-point story structure personally. You kind of refine and develop your character arcs in more detail, and you begin to plan your individual scenes. Now, for some books I've written, like Kingdom of Dragons, this might result in a super detailed 30-page outline that breaks down every single chapter with a lot of information for each chapter. For other books I've written, like The Thunder Heist, I just wrote a few pages of kind of sparse bullet points. Like I tell my students, it really just comes down to what you need to feel clear and motivated with your story. If you want to dive deeper into my outlining process, then check this video over here where I walk through the hourglass outlining method step by step. Now, something that makes the outlining process so much easier is to have a centralized second brain where you can be storing all the information you develop for your story. And this brings me to the 8th big lesson that a lot of my clients have found really valuable. Build a story Bible. What exactly is a story Bible? Well, put simply, it's just a place where you can keep track of your character notes, world building details, plot structure, your chapter by chapter or scene by scene outlines, any notes you might have about your theme or premise, and really just anything else that you want to reference as you write. While your one-page guiding principles document is a really great high-level summary that's good to actually keep next to you on the desk as you write, your story Bible becomes this in-depth personal Wikipedia that you can build to keep track of all those other little details that go into writing a great fantasy novel. Personally, I've spent the last 3 or so years building out my own story Bible for The Blade and the Fang, which is the current series I'm writing and contains Kingdom of Dragons, which is already published, and Sorrow of the Sun, which is my working title for the sequel. I actually just finished the 160,000 word first draft for this the other day, which is really exciting, and I've built my story Bible in Notion. And let me tell you, having this story Bible, especially for writing book 2 in a series, has been insanely useful because rather than having to search back through my first book to remind myself of key details about the religion of the Sun Wardens or names of background characters or any of these other little things like that, they're all inside my story Bible, and it makes it so much easier to reference and maintain continuity. In my fantasy outlining bootcamp, I actually give my students a modified, templatized version of this story Bible that sort of walks them step by step through the outlining process to help them build up this second brain for their story.
I really appreciate the online workbooks he's set up for us. You know, I've tried World Anvil, I've tried Campfire before, but I think what Jed's created here is way, way better.
The reason I specifically suggest building your story Bible in Notion rather than using some of the other platforms that exist out there is because Notion is free. It's fully customizable, and it also allows you to create your own templates, your own questions, your own workflows to suit the story you want to write. They're not sponsoring this video or anything, it's just the tool that I personally use. For example, one of the things I've built into my story Bible is a character interview exercise where you basically answer all these specific questions in the voice of your character. Here's what Jonathan Hoff said about this in my recent client survey. The most useful writing lesson I learned from Jed was the character interview exercise. Jed outlined this in Notion, submitting several questions that you're meant to answer in the voice of your character, such as what makes you cry, what makes you happy, or what is one secret you've never told anyone. The insight I gained from these exercises has helped me shape my characters in a way that makes them all unique, and I know I can apply this knowledge to any character I create in the future. I'm no longer afraid that I don't understand my characters enough to know what they would do in a given situation. I'm planning to actually do a full YouTube video soon where I'll give you a complete tour through my story Bible in more depth, so make sure you're subscribed if you want to see that when it drops. Now, this brings me to the 9th big lesson that my 170 plus fantasy writing students have found useful, and it is to always ask the Armstrong question. This principle is one I shamelessly stole from Peter Armstrong, Brandon Sanderson's in-house editor. Really hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It is a question I've found tremendously useful, especially in those moments, and they come all the time, where I'm feeling stuck or uninspired or just feeling a bit blocked by a scene I'm writing. The question is very simple, but it's very, very powerful. Why will this scene be someone's favorite scene in the entire story? So to give an example of this, let's say you're writing a scene where the main focus is just to give some exposition and some background details about this sort of key historical event that happened in your story. And maybe as you're going through and you're writing that scene, you're staring at your computer and it just feels a little bit boring and it feels a little bit flat for you, and as a result, maybe you kind of procrastinate on writing it. No. That's not good enough. You're going to ask this question. Why would this scene be someone's favorite scene in the entire story? And when you ask that question, it's amazing what ideas that begins to generate. Because remember, this has got to be someone's favorite scene in your book. So maybe we take that scene, and perhaps the only way for your protagonist to learn this particular history detail is to talk with a very sarcastic and dismissive historian who's giving them the information, but also delivering these really hilarious put-downs and insults as they go through this. And this historian character just becomes this ball of dry humor and witty energy that completely steals the scene and almost distracts you from the fact that this scene exists, or at least initially existed, only to give you this world-building information. Whenever I pose the Armstrong question to my students, it almost always reignites their excitement and helps them to turn boring scenes into exciting ones. As one writer from my third boot camp put it, and she asked to remain anonymous, so I won't name her here, I think one of the most important things that you said was to find why each moment would be someone's favorite moment in your story, and that this trick will not only make your story more enjoyable to read, but it will make it easier and more fun to write. And this writer finished up the bootcamp in July of 2024, and 9 months later, she's over 140,000 words into her story, and she actually messaged me the other day to tell me that she has just hit the climax, which is super, super exciting. Really, really proud of her progress. And speaking of your climax, this brings me to the next big lesson that my students found useful. And this is one of those incredibly powerful lessons that, for me at least, and for a lot of my students, just kind of radically changes the way you look at storytelling for the better. And this lesson is to work your way backwards from your ending. Your ending has the biggest emotional impact on your reader. I mean, just think about your own experience. How many times have you read a story that was great and it was amazing for the first 90%, but then the ending just kind of fell off a cliff and you realize that everything that came before, it wasn't really setting up anything meaningful. That is the exact mistake I personally made with my first attempt at writing a novel. When I started writing the Aeon Academy when I was about 14 years old, 14? I think I was 14 when I started that. I didn't really know how it was going to end. I just let the story play out, and eventually I realized, I needed to wrap it up in a particular way. It feels like I'm overstaying my welcome here. And so I wrapped it up and I wrote the climax, but it didn't really land in the most powerful way it could have. And that's one of the many reasons why that novel never really got to a place where I felt confident enough in trying to get it published, even after 5 years of editing and rewriting it from scratch a couple of times. By comparison, when I wrote Across the Broken Stars, the ending was one of the very first things that came to me. I worked backwards from that ending very intentionally, making sure that the protagonist I had at the start of the story was a very different, very flawed person compared to where he ends up at the end. And this gave Leon this very satisfying character arc where he's struggling to sort of grow and overcome these flaws as the story progresses. And I think this is the reason why this story was so much easier to write and has had such a good reaction from readers. By knowing your ending ahead of time, you can ensure that everything that comes before it builds towards this incredibly satisfying emotional payoff. And if you want to avoid the most common ending mistakes that I see new fantasy writers make all the time, you should check out this video over here, because inside that video, I go into much more detail about how to write a great ending that leaves your readers on a high note. Keep writing and keep striving.